In this tutorial, we're going to look at some of the strengths and limitations of using questionnaires as a data gathering method. Now, this is a common type of question in SQA Advanced Hydrography exams. And what it's really wanting you to consider is why would you use this? What's a good reason to use questionnaire? And also, what are potential limitations? So let's just break that down and think about the strengths first of all. Why would you use a questionnaire? Well, questionnaires, unlike interviews, are much quicker. And that's because the questions are shorter and each question itself can be responded to quite quickly. So, for example, if we have a look at this question here, on a scale of 1 to 5, there is only one response. And apart from the time it takes from the person to consider what score they would give this question, you are able to capture data quite quickly. Another strength of this particular type of questioning technique where people score is that it does give you numerical data, which, unlike in an interview, which tends to be all verbal data where people respond with long and lengthy answers, it's going to benefit from giving you some numbers. A number of questions, another strength is will allow you to gather data which you can then categorize. So, for example, in this question, people are allowed to select why they visited whatever it was they visited. It might be in a town centre, for example. And they can select more than one answer. Now, why that gives you good data is you will obviously find out the frequency of each response. So if you do survey enough people, you're going to be able to then categorize how many said shopping, how many said sightseeing, and so on and so forth. And because it's a quick data gathering method, it allows you to conduct a number of questionnaires quite rapidly to gather a very wide set of data, rather than interviews which take much longer and need to be set up in advance, and also to conduct them a lot more time is taken. So you can see from a couple of examples I've given you, there are some significant strengths to using questionnaires. Questionnaires are also fantastic for finding out people's views on things. Certainly, if you're doing a human geography investigation and you're trying to find out somebody's perception or their attitudes about something, you can ask a series of questions that explore those. In creating the questions, you get a chance to frame how the responses are given, which is a strength in itself because you get to predetermine what it is you want to gather data on. Now, that brings us to some of the limitations, however, and a good chunk of this answer really should focus on some of the limitations of any data gathering method. You want to think about what its weaknesses are. So one of them is questionnaires are generally made up mainly of what we call closed questions, where you predetermine the outcome of the answer in advance, which means you do need a lot of background knowledge in order to determine what the answer might be, which people can choose from. And that leads us to another problem with closed questions. People have no flexibility over what they want to say. They have to go with the options that you present them. In terms of scaling systems like this scaling of 1 to 5 or the bipolar system, which is a minus to positive scoring system, a lot of people don't often think about responses in those terms, and actually asking them to give a score to something can be quite difficult, especially if they're not given the ability to have a neutral score when they give that. So that can be another limitation of questionnaires. A further limitation is many questionnaires are very poorly worded, and the actual answer that you're wanting people to give can be quite difficult, or by asking the question itself, you are already biasing. If we take a look at this question here, for example, we are biasing this question by even suggesting that people actually prefer one supermarket over another. And they might actually not like supermarkets at all, or they might like all of them. But we are, in the wording of our question, assuming that people would have a preference or not. So that is bringing our own bias into the question that we are asking. Interviews, in contrast, do something very different. Interviews give you a very deep, in-depth and detailed idea of why something might be happening, and they give people the freedom to respond to a question in any way, obviously within the parameters of how you have asked and framed the question in the first place. But you often discover things that you hadn't thought about when you ask open questions. So here we can see an open question, a sort of what do you think type of question. And that is both a strength in a questionnaire, but generally because interviews are made up of mainly of open questions, it's certainly a strength of an interview, but one of the weaknesses of questionnaires. Questionnaires also don't give us the ability to do supplementary questions, whereas in an interview situation, sometimes somebody's response can then stimulate an idea in your mind about what you might then want to ask as a follow-up question that you hadn't considered before. Whereas a questionnaire is pre-written and predetermined, and therefore there's no flexibility to add additional questions at the end. So that's just a quick summary of the various strengths and weaknesses of this particular data gathering method.